Hello again. I was reading in Amy Chua's recent book last night, and there was something in it that got me thinking. She makes what I think is a common point and a common misconception about the nature of ethnicities, of national identification, of tribal identification. I mean, she's making a lot of good points about the way that we psychologically balkanize ourselves into various tribes and kind of like compete there. And she does make the point that the United States is not what we would call an ethnic nation, that it is a tribe of tribes, as she puts it, that there's tons of variable identities. We have, the Irish American crowd, or the African American crowd, or et cetera, different religious groupings as well. I mean, from the waves of migration that have come in here, that we lack a kind of coherent, long-term sort of ethno-national identity, and that's accurate as far as it goes. We have created a kind of national identity that is relatively coherent, although it has a long history of exclusions that kind of like separate it. We break people up into different groups, but there is a kind of like common American myth, a sort of like American ideal that anyone living here can subscribe to. Now, where I think she's really off base is in the argument that other countries do have an ethnic identity, that they are ethnic nations, they are ethnic tribes, and I think that she's a bit off in this. Let me give you just a little quote from this. Let's see. But it would be odd to refer to Irish French or Japanese Korean. But in the United States, you can be Irish American, Japanese American, Egyptian American, or whatever. Blah blah blah. And I think that this profoundly misunderstands the flexibility that exists in national and ethnic identification. Ethnicities are not races. They're not somehow locked in physically. And there's a tremendous amount of self-identification involved in being part of one. There's also a tremendously long history of constant migration and movement into all of these older nations in the world that have also affected their makeup. Just to speak to the example there, it'd be odd to speak of Irish French. Well, why? What about the Algerian French and Moroccan French? What about the Senegalese French? Right? Are they not French? What about all the Caribbean French? How about all the migration from within Europe? I mean, the Poles and whatnot that settled there. Nicolas Sarkozy, the former president of France, 2 presidents ago, he's Hungarian, by ethnic origin, by national origin. He is a son of a Hungarian migrant. So why is he not Hungarian French? It's a choice for them not to divide themselves up as much by identity. There is an attempt not to do that in many of these places that I think has been more absent in the American experience as a much more consciously immigrant nation. This is not to say that these other countries do not have long histories of immigration. France has been utterly dependent upon immigration for its population growth for more than a century. By the beginning of the 20th century, it was already utterly dependent upon migration in order to account for any population growth. Earlier on, that was migration mostly from within Europe, Belgians, Poles, whatever, that moved into there. By mid-century, it had shifted to the former colonized world, Vietnamese, West Africans, Caribbeans, tons of people that, migrating in. The former North African territories. So they do have long histories of migration, and there are hyphenated identities if they choose to use them. The fact that people often do not is a whole different matter. But to say that they're not an ethnic, they are an ethnic nation in the sense that there is a French identity where we're not. I mean, we have to be careful to understand the degree to which that is a choice, that we choose this kind of balkanized identity. Now, to sort of break down a little bit of the kind of diversity, and just to show you that this sort of like example, I want to break down a couple of like basic categories. I want to show you the degree to which countries like France is a good example. Italy is another one I can use today. The degree to which these countries, as an ethnic identification, as a national identification, is an artificial project. It's a project created in the modern period for modern purposes and does not actually have a long history. To do that, I need first to break down a few basic terms, right? Because we, in the United States, in popular discourse, tend to use a lot of words interchangeably that really should not be. Country and nation and state, for example, are all sloppily used. So I'm going to define, those three as well as ethnicity. Let's start with country. Country should be easy, right? This is my country, the United States. Well, what is a country? A country is the land. It is the physical land, as well as generally the government in control of that land, whatever sovereign government controls that land. Sovereign government plus land equals country. Straightforward enough, right? A state is similar, but state is a lot less connected to the physical land. A state is a government and its institutions. Right? It usually refers to sovereign states with borders and everything else here, but not necessarily. For example, the state of Palestine is a state despite not actually being a country. All right? You see how that works there? They do have a governing institution. They do have, police forcing, etc., etc. here. They just do not have sovereign control over the territory. But they do have the functioning institutions, and that's what makes you a state. So, country and state. So what's a nation? Nation is often used sloppily to refer to country. This is my nation, the United States. Well, that's actually a very sloppy use here. Nation is the people, just the people. It is a people with a common culture, a common language usually, some kind of like common ethnic background. We'll talk about that in just a second here. A common history, certain traditions, things that kind of link the peoples together. This is one of the problems here with the concept of nationalism. I'll mention something about that in just a moment here. But a nation is the people. It has nothing to do with the country or the state per se, right? You can be a nation and have neither a country nor a state, right? The Basque are a good example of that. The Basque clearly are a nation. They're a distinct people with a distinct culture, history, traditions, language, etc., and yet they're divided between two different countries and have no state institutions of their own. About Kurds, divided amongst four countries, or the Balochis, divided between two, Iran and Pakistan. I mean, these are distinct nations, but clearly not countries or states. So the separation there, I think, is a very important one. Now, ethnicity is similar. Ethnicity is basically nation, but it also denotes origin. Now, people can adopt a nation. So, if person A migrates into territory B and sets up roots there and adopts the local culture, he has become a part of that nation. But he may also have a separate ethnic identity. So, for example, in our example earlier of Algerian French, the Algerian French is a Frenchman. He speaks French. He has adopted large elements of French culture. He lives in France. But his family origin is in Algeria, so he could be considered ethnically Algerian. Ethnicity is not race. It denotes origins. That's it, right? A national origin. So, related but distinct. So you can see that country and state are related but distinct. There is a clear separation between them, and nation and ethnicity are related, but there is a clear distinction between them. All four terms together are often extremely sloppily used. Now, I'll give you an example of that. Nationalism is often taken to mean patriotism, sometimes to mean kind of extreme patriotism, but patriotism nonetheless. I love my country. If you love your country, you are not a nationalist. A nationalist loves his nation. Nationalists love the people, which means it's about culture and ethnicity. Your loyalty is to the culture and to the ethnicity, not to the country and not to the state, i.e. not to its government or institutions or traditions, but to the people, which makes nationalism inherently exclusionary and, well, we'd have to call it ethno-national in character. It is quite easy to argue that nationalism is, by definition, racist, using the older use of race where, for example, there wasn't a white race, but there was a French race and a German race, i.e. different groups of people. Race, again, is not a technical or scientific term. It is an extremely flexible term that's been used in various ways over the past millennia. But if you are fighting for your people, whether to have a state of your own or to serve the interest of your particular people, you are a nationalist. If you are fighting for your country and the interests of your country, that's not nationalism, that's patriotism. The two can overlap. Someone can be both a patriot and a nationalist, or they can be quite separate. A good example of that, for example, would be the much of the settler movement in the West Bank that's controlled by Israel. Israelis who have migrated into there, oftentimes they are Jewish nationalists and are fighting for Jewish ethno-national control, and they will fight back against the Israeli state if they have to. Settlers have frequently taken shots at Israel Defense Forces troops because their loyalty is not to the state of Israel, it is to their understanding of the Jewish people. You see how they're distinct there? Whereas the identity of somebody living within the 1948 borders of Israel can be nationalist and a patriot, and loyal to the state and to the state's will, per se. They can overlap, where somebody can be a patriot and not at all a nationalist. I know plenty of cosmopolitan Israelis, for example, who do not think of themselves in somehow distinct or superior to the Palestinian Arabs, for example. So these terms are used in a kind of like overlapping sloppy mishmash here, but they really should not be. They are all quite distinct. Now, to sort of counter the kind of like ethnic nation myth that somehow there is such a thing as Italianness or Frenchness outside of a project of state formation and nation formation in the modern period, I thought I'd show you a little bit of the ethnic and cultural and linguistic diversity in just two countries as an example. So you'll forgive me, this isn't wonderful. I actually drew two little maps for you this morning. So I drew Italy and France. It's probably not terrible, right? But good enough. So let's take a look here, and we'll just sort of wander around the periphery here and sort of look at who lives there still today, now, speaking these things. Now, this is not comprehensive. There are many, many more languages and ethnicities present in both of these countries, and I will mention here. But I want to sort of almost overwhelm you. I mean, again, not with everything, but kind of almost overwhelm you with the amount of diversity that there is present here, to sort of undermine this narrative that there is such a thing as Italians outside of a conscious political choice and personal choice to be Italian. So let's start around down here. So we'd have our Romanesco people, so speaking the form of the Italian language that's common in Rome. This is not too far off from Standard Italian, small differences here. Moving a little farther south, though, the Neapolitan dialect here is spoken around Naples and Apulia and the cities here in the south. The old Roman district of Campania. This area here would be, commonly speaking, what we can call a Neapolitan language. It is quite distinct. It has some mutual intelligibility with Italian, but also a significant amount of difference here. But if you cross over the straits here, pass through Calabria and into Sicily here, the Sicilian language is entirely distinct. It's not really mutually intelligible with Standard Italian unless you're going to speak very slowly, maybe write some things out. There's a lot of distinct vocabulary. that is unique to Sicilian. There's some distinct syntax distinct to Sicilian here. The pronunciation varies a good bit. People who, as most people are, know both languages and can code switch between them. You can see the influence between them. You can see the Sicilian speakers can speak with a more they can choose to speak with a more Italian accent to be more easily understood, or they can code switch to speak with only purely Sicilian speakers and quickly leave you in the dust. Looking back over still in just southern Italy and leaving out the other Italian dialects in the area here, I can mention two distinct ones here. There have long been Albanian speakers in southern Italy, and Albanian is a language isolate in the Indo-European family, completely unrelated to the Italic languages. And there are also speakers of what in Italy is called Greco, literally Greek. Spoken in a number of villages in southern Italy from descendants of people who had settled there 2,800 years ago, when southern Italy was called Magna Graecia. Right? It was part of the Greek world, and they still speak Greek in some of these villages, which is interesting. So let's kind of cruise up along the way here. Again, I'm going to leave out a lot of smaller dialects here and focus on some of the bigger ones here. So Emiliano and Romagnol is this area right here. This is sort of a dialect spectrum. One of the reasons it's hyphenated in the first place, because you can separate between the two of them, but they're closely related. And again, highly distinct from Standard Italian. Move a little farther up, even more so distinct here. Venetian, spoken in this area here, Veneto. And then Friulian, spoken a little bit farther over. Both of these distinctly different languages from Standard Italian. In official discourse, Italy considers them to be dialects of Italian, but that's a nationalist designation. All right. As far as linguists are concerned, these are different languages. That they're not mutually intelligible. People in Venice will generally be bilingual and will code switch. Right? They'll speak Venetian with other Venetians, and they'll speak Italian with everyone else. Right. Moving across the top here, you've got, Lombard is still a significant language all across the top here, right? And then, over here we can also put in a couple of minority languages. How about Slovene? From Melania Trump, right? The Slovene language is spoken in portions of Italy, and there's a significant chunk right in here that speaks the Austro-Bavarian dialect of German. Which again is a distinct language. We call it a dialect, but Austro-Bavarian is not intelligible with other forms of German per se. I mean, it has a very distinct grammar, tons of distinct vocabulary. It's related, but a different language here, and that's because the South Tyrol used to be part of Austria and was taken into Italy only after World War I. Right, so Italy acquired a large German-speaking population. Go figure, most of them still speak German. Right, so you get then Piedmontese over here, and Ligurian along the southern coast here, like where Genoa is, and then of course there are several dialects of Sardinian, and there are actually Catalan speakers on Sardinia as well. Catalan, of course, being from over here in what is today a portion of eastern Spain. But finally, this area right here, all right, Tuscany, is actually where the Standard Italian language is born. All right, they created a modern standard dialect, created a modern standard language for the educational system based on the Tuscan language. Right, so it is still its own distinct thing, but is also the basis for Standard Italian. All right, so I'll make it a little bit shorter here for France. We'll take a nice little quick tour through France. You can kind of see how this works. Then I'll explain why I'm bothering to tell you this, that this isn't just completely pointless random trivia. There is a method to the madness. Right, so let's see what we've got here. So let's start in the south here. So right in here in France, they speak Basque, right? Because the Basque country kind of overlaps here into Spain. Right, and into France here. Then along the southern part here, you have several languages in a particular spectrum. We tend to call them the Occitan languages, to separate them from like the the region in the north, the langues d'oui versus the langue d'oc, from the word for yes. So oui is yes in like French, right? But oc is yes down here. So Gascon here, and then two forms of Central Occitan here, and then Provençal here. Right, all distinct languages with distinct histories, and there's a spectrum going along here. The Gascon and Occitan languages in general overlap into Catalan. Yeah, Catalan is actually more similar to the Occitan languages than Occitan is to French, if that gives you some idea of the historical relationships here. And the farther over here, the Provençal language and what's sometimes called Franco-Provençal here, or Romand is actually not far off from like Piedmontese. I mean, there's a significant overlap with the former languages, the languages spoken in like the former Duchy of Savoy, that kind of like overlaps the borders of three countries here. So that covers a little run through the south here, other than like, Corsica. Let's put Corsica on there. Yes, Corsica has a language, right? It is distinct. Moving a bit farther up here, past Romand, we have an Alemannic German language. Sometimes we can just simplify that and call it Alsatian, right? It is a Western Alemannic German dialect, low Alemannic dialect, which means it is also not the same as the Austro-Bavarian dialect I mentioned before, spoken here, and it's not at all like the German that you would have studied, say, in high school or college, right? But that's the language spoken here. We've got Picard here. We've got Norman here. Norman is a variety of the old langue d'oui basis from French here, but with significant influences because, Vikings settled there for one thing. Cruise over to here. Who lives here? The Breton. Brittany uses the Breton language, although it's been steadily shrinking in area. And the Breton language is a Brythonic Celtic language closely related to Cornish and Welsh. Right? It was originally an insular Celtic language, and some people had migrated there quite some time ago and established it there throughout this entire area. Right? So there's still a Celtic culture here. So where's French come from? Well, French comes from the area around the Ile-de-France, the area around Paris. Right? It's literally just that area. This is where French is from. And it becomes a national language, right? Now, I chose these two as examples for a reason. Italy is a relatively recent creation as a country, as a nation state. Italy only goes back to like 1860, right? So, there's a long process of Italian unification here. All across the 1850s and 60s that put together a distinct country. I think it was finally finished in like, it was 1870s. They finally took Rome from the Vatican. I can't remember exactly the year, but the Italian unification brought together all these different areas. It brought together several distinct regional nationalist movements here. Cavour in the south, Cavour in the north, Garibaldi in the south. Distinct movements here to try and fight off foreign control and bring together several different territories. And this eventually was successful and knitted together a single country. And from that, they chose to follow a particular nationalist model of fostering a particular national identity. Now, the model they followed was actually pioneered in places like France and the generations before this. Now, France as a state is much, much older. Right, so Italy as a state only coming into existence around 1860. If you can push France actually back as far as the 4th century, if you want. Right, France is one of the original successor states to the Western Roman Empire. As a state, it's been around for a very long time. It has long roots, so to speak, and its borders have changed here and there, but they've been relatively consistent in its core areas for a long time. Right, so it does have a long, consistent history within that area. And yet, it had a tremendous amount of regional diversity. Different cultures, different languages. I mean, Celtic peoples, Basque peoples, German speakers, speakers of Italic languages, the Languedoc and the Languedoc. I mean, they're very distinct cultures here. Vikings in the north. I mean, all kinds of different peoples here. So what brought them together? Well, only their loyalty to the monarchy, only their loyalty to the state. It was a patriotism that you could have before, and that was really it. Beyond that, people's identities were regional. They were local, right? And that's where you could point to a kind of like, tribalism present in France as well, and have a kind of like, a hybridized identity there, a hyphenated identity for all the different peoples there. What brought them together and made them all Frenchmen was a political project, and that project is rooted in the French Revolution. The French Revolution unveiled, a whole range of new ideas. It's a significant step toward the development of the modern world. It's something that I'll talk about in a whole distinct lecture on another day here. But out of that, we see a number of techniques developing. The first of which, the levée en masse, that happens during the French Revolution, a mass conscription of people here, gives us one of the first major pillars of building a common national identity. If you conscript people into an army, the first thing you got to do is give them a common language. Because if I bark the order to march and everyone speaks 5 different languages, they're not going to understand me, and the troops are not going to move. It's not going to work very well. So they settled on a national language and taught it to people. Along with that, they taught certain national myths. This is our flag. We stand for liberty, equality, brotherhood. This is these are our virtues. We're going to spread these ideas of democracy and human rights and and this is what it means to be a Frenchman, and to have so you give a certain set of symbols, right? The nations, the Marseillaise. You give certain symbolic features, and then you give them certain characteristics, certain traits that have to identify your nation. And in the process, you bring together different people. You teach them that common language, right? And those common ideals. And then, once united under those institutions, you have the beginnings of a nationalist movement, right? A movement by a nation to further the interests of a state. But you have to first create that nation. And that process of turning peasants into Frenchmen in Eugene Weber's relatively famous formulation was a long process. Right? This is a process that goes back here to the early 19th century, the late 18th, if you want to go back to the levée en masse and the Revolutionary Wars itself, and continued all the way through the 19th century, and in many ways continues all the way to the present. What goes along with the military? Education. Education is the single largest other component to building a national identity. If you build a national education system and you teach people, this is what it means to be French, we stand up, think about your education in the United States, for example. You get up in the morning with the teacher and all that, and you say the Pledge of Allegiance, etc., and you learn in class that this is the land of the free and the home of the brave. There's certain ideals that kind of get beaten into your head about what it means to be an American. Well, that's done everywhere. That's done in every modern state. Every single modern state does this. That's a process we'll talk about in another lecture as well. The way that states do this, and the why they do this, and how this is useful in any way. But the fact that they're doing it is our point today, right? That it is a conscious project by the state, i.e., by the government, to create a nation. Do you see how that works? Elements of nations can pre-exist. Elements of nations develop organically, right? These different languages all developed organically out of the settlement of Romans and the fragmentation of their language, etc., etc. There's all kinds of things that go into that here, but making it a political identity, that's different. Turning those elements of a nation into a political identity is a choice, and in the same way that limiting the variability and reducing all of this diversity here into a single national identity. I mean, many of these states, France included, actually has discouraged the regional languages for a long time. and as a consequence, many of them are severely endangered, right? And maybe going extinct in the coming century, right? The Breton language is spoken in the very far west. All of the Occitan languages are shrinking. I mean, in many areas, French is becoming the only language, right? Because people are choosing not to pass on the language of their youth. And that again, that is a political choice driven by state policy, and it's also a local and individual choice, right? Someone's decision not to fight to preserve that original distinctiveness, someone's decision not to pass on their ancestral language, right? In the long run, together they can create a sense of Frenchness that brings all these people together, or Italianness that brings these people together, but that is a political project in the modern period. And it is a myth to say that these are ethnic nations that have long histories and do not have this, anything like the U.S. experience of being an immigrant nation, or a nation composed of, a country composed of different nations, different tribes, people of different origins, right? You see, even I mixed the word up there for a minute. It's very common. Forming a country out of disparate nations is pretty much the norm in the world. Right? Whether it's through immigration, as our story is, or the Australian story, or the Canadian story, or simply through accretion of territory, as in the case of, say, France or Italy, right? As well as through migration. I mentioned some more recent migration into France as an example. The last one I want to point to here that kind of addresses this myth of ethnic nations. I want to point to a couple of really big categories, big confusing categories that we use all the time. I see all the time references to the ethnic Chinese or Arabs or Hispanic people as kind of like ethnic groups, as distinct, ethnic groups or national groups. And this is in many ways utter nonsense. It's a category. It's a sort of shorthand. What makes somebody ethnically Chinese or Han Chinese is simply living in the territory formerly under control of the Han dynasty, right? One of the great early Chinese empires, the second Chinese imperial dynasty, ruled from the last 2 centuries before the Common Era and the first 2 centuries of the Common Era. So 2,000 years ago. And the territory it controls is relatively small if you look at a map of modern China today. It's really only the broad chunk in the center of the east. But slowly drifting farther down. And then through migration, through assimilation into there, people adopted a kind of Han Chinese identity. But within that area, people speak broadly different languages. Right? The Min language, the Cantonese language, the Mandarin language, they're not mutually intelligible. Right? You cannot put a Cantonese speaker and a Mandarin speaker and have them figure anything out about what the other is saying. They have to write it down to make any sense at all, because they have completely different origins to their spoken languages. Right? What links them together is an old political connection and a political choice to unite this area into a single state and then passing on that identity. You see what I'm kind of getting at here? So the ethnicity is not somehow in the race or the language or the culture. It's a political choice. It's Arab is one, right? If you want to talk about Arabs as an ethnicity, then only the people of the Arabian Peninsula count. Right, and even there, you have a number of people that don't quite fit that. I mean, the Sabaean culture, from where today Yemen is, was quite distinct from most of Arabia for most of its history. So we'd have to separate the South Arabian languages. But if we look at the central part of the Arabian Peninsula, okay, Arabs are from there. What about all the rest of the Arabs? They run into this all the time in things like, propagandistic stuff around the Israel-Palestine conflict, for example. Oh, look, Israel's small, and there's so many other Arab countries. Why can't the Palestinians just move to another Arab country because they're Arabs too? It misunderstands the degree to which Arab is a constructed modern identity that has no real depth on the ground. The peoples of Iraq today are descendants of the ancient Mesopotamian cultures, Sumerians, Akkadians, Assyrians, Chaldeans, right? The peoples who always lived there. The peoples today of Egypt are descendants of pyramid builders. They're the descendants of the old Kemetic culture of ancient Egypt. The peoples of Algeria are descended from the Berber culture, or Tunisia from the Berber culture as well as the Carthaginian culture. Biologically, these people are all quite disparate. The Syrian population, the Syrian Lebanese population, the population of Western Jordan, as well as the Palestinians and large portions of the Jewish people, all actually have a common descent in the old Canaanite Levantine culture. Right? They have the same exact biological roots. Right? Some of them have gone off in different directions since then, in the past 2,000 years, but they have a common Levantine origin. Levantine is a distinct, physically, ethnic designation that is separate historically from Arab. It's considered Arab today because the ancestors of most of the peoples of Levant, the peoples in today, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Palestine, adopted the Arabic language. Now, the Arabic language has a tremendous amount of variation. I mean, Moroccan Arabic is not mutually intelligible with Egyptian or Iraqi Arabic, right? But that's a whole different issue here. The point is, they adopted the Arabic of the Quran, the classical Arabic, and then it evolved from there. It diverged from there, from various local influences and other linguistic influences. But having adopted a form of the Arabic language, that's all that makes them Arab. That's it. So Arabs identifying with one another is a conscious, modern political choice, and a very recent one at that. It's not ethnic in the sense of like a common origin. They do not have a common origin, right? In this, the same way we can talk about much smaller groupings of people. Hispanic is an even funnier one, right? Hispanic just means you speak one of the languages of the Iberian Peninsula, right? So you're a Spanish speaker, right? That's really it, right? But culturally, ethnically, right, by national origin, a Uruguayan and a Peruvian and a Nicaraguan and a Mexican are very different people, right? And even within a lot of these, especially larger countries like Mexico has some of the, I believe, the highest number of endangered languages in the entire world. Mexico is an extremely diverse state linguistically. We tend to think, Mexicans all speak Mexican Spanish. No. Lots of them speak indigenous languages, right? Although most of those indigenous languages are severely endangered. Some of them are still pretty strong. Many of them are severely endangered. Anyway, we could take examples from anywhere in the world and kind of dive into them and pull out tons of examples of different languages spoken here and look at all the different languages of Mexico. But I think you kind of get the point here that the world is a lot more distinct and broken up by different, nations and ethnicities than we tend to think it is. And the U.S. is not as unusual or distinct in its origins as a collection of tribes or ethnicities, as a tribe of tribes as we tend to think. All right, so that's my little discussion for today. See you later.